Hi everyone, I want to give a lesson on drawing geometric solids. This is very similar to a drawing that I do every semester. It's part of a series where we are drawing objects, common objects that have recognizable and easy to memorize patterns of light and shadow. So I want to use a little bit of two-point perspective thinking here to draw a block. It's not necessarily a perfect cube, it's fine if it's not, but the idea is that I can see three sides of that object readily. I'm going to move over here, and then from this handout here I'll borrow this 12-sided object. This 12-sided object has a lot of 5-sided forms in here that you can break down. This one is more or less straight on. The rest of them have a lot of perspective on them, so you have to use a lot of perspective thinking as well as thinking about massing and light and shadow on this object. So this 12-sided form, artists have been fascinated with this for a long time, even since ancient times. It's one of the Platonic solids. So Plato even had some hypothesis about some solid objects, and Renaissance artists additionally had some interest in 12-sided forms. So this object, sometimes called a dodecahedron. So it's worth studying, and it's kind of fun to draw. I like it because it has aspects or elements that are similar to a box, but also similar to a ball. It's challenging to see, but there's probably a point back there somewhere. I'm just completing these facets or these planes of this object based on observation here. So I'm copying some source material and enlarging, but I'm also using a lot of logic and deduction and guesswork, estimation to help me size these things on the paper correctly. I'm going to take a paper towel here. This is called glazing. Sometimes it just actually helps to push your charcoal in slightly. You can see it kind of smears a little bit, but that's okay. That glaze is kind of a desirable thing. It lets us clean it up. And what I've done by pushing my lines in a little bit is actually make them a little more stable and less messy, so they become a little more predictable, and I can continue to develop new things on and around these objects. So I have a shadow here that I can sort of copy. I'm going to start with that because then I have to draw a shadow here that sort of matches the one that I'm going to put on this object. So let's see. When I look at this, and I've tried to talk about this in other videos, the beginner often sees just a single line here. But what I want you to do is not to see a single line here at the bottom edge of this object, but to teach yourself that there's two lines on this side of the form where the object is in full lighting. So same thing would be happening here on this shape. I don't want to just make this line that's going to be full light be one thick blurry line, but rather it's going to work better for my shading, my massing strategy, if I double that line up. Just make two little skinny lines that are paralleling each other along the length of that object. And again, what that's going to do is let me get my charcoal point in there and shade. So it's giving me a shape to paint inside of. It's a little bit like in computer art too, when you get asked, you often have to close pathways or cut out areas so that when you paint something in, it doesn't spill. So when you know where your shapes are, it gives you more confidence for massing, because then you can assign it a note or a value on the scale. And there's a few notes that we like to start with on drawings like this. I can't see all of this, so I'm just going to kind of make it up, but I'm using a couple points of reference from the photograph here to help me. These are examples from different drawing books that are commonly used in college courses. Well, if I got really picky about it, there would probably be some little angular cuts here, or facets on this outline or this rim core of my cast shadow. On a ball, it would be a spherical and smooth, but on this form, we're going to basically, it's kind of a ball shape, but it might have a couple of little hints of some more angular type edges that are indicating plane changes on this form. Those plane changes would be much more apparent here. So let's think about this ball. So if this angle of light and shadow, this angle of shadow here, if this angle of shadow here is trailing off kind of like that, then I can make a kind of educated or calculated guess that I'm going to have some kind of angle of shadow trailing off here at a fairly similar orientation. It's going to be slightly different because this one is tipping out to me slightly, whereas this face is vertical. So I think this one would probably be pushing back just a little bit more. So if this one is at that angle, maybe this one is a little bit flatter. But they would be very similar. I don't like a lot of these eraser crumbs and other things that come from corrections. You can see it doesn't hurt my drawing to swipe at it with some paper towel. It actually kind of makes it better in a way, as long as I don't overdo that. So what's happening here is I'm projecting a shadow, and this front face here, this front corner, this leading edge, is the main thing that needs to get projected first. Once you understand that geometry, so this also is getting projected. So we get to this, we come up this line, and we get to this intersection, and there's an imaginary line that's connecting us down to the shadow here. So we can take that geometry and sort of echo it through every object in our drawing, and that gives the artist ability to sort of make up a lot of things in a picture. So that line is getting projected down, and I'm also using a lot of imagination because I want it to fit. I'm just making it up, but this is what artists do all the time, is we sort of base stuff on what we know and what we can see, but then we're going to arrange it in our picture. But okay, so I'm going to project this downward. And then I get here, and I have that line, and then I project that line over. And then what would happen is I get to that intersection, I could project downward again. Essentially the same angle here to find the corner of that shadow. And then this turns a corner, and then the back of the shadow is going to be running that way as well. So again, I'm kind of using a little bit of creative license, but I don't want to put a sharp point right on the outline of that object. So I'm going to conveniently make that shadow just sort of go behind there, but also do what it's sort of supposed to, which is this edge, or this rim core, and this edge are parallel to the sides that are making it. This vertical face is what is expressing or showing the angle of shadow. And then these imaginary lines, these projection lines, which I'm pretty flexible about right now because I'm trying to balance the light out for something in an imaginary drawing. But I can do that using some kinds of geometry and a little bit of knowledge about shadow projection. So once I I base it on something here, and I brought that geometry over here, but then I want to come back and sort of just check the alignment here, check the logic of some of the shadow shapes and the projections here. So this is just part of using your imagination to apply some rules about making objects or drawing objects with more of a realistic sort of approach. These kinds of operations and things that we're doing here you can apply these concepts more broadly to any art material really that you wanted to work with. So I've got my forms drawn in, and I want to complete my page division. I don't mind using a ruler sometimes. I'll use it. I want to use a ruler here to straighten up some of the edges on the block, and maybe even I could even use it here. So I'm going to bring a little bit more mechanical looking structure into these forms. You'll probably find as you start to draw that your lines are going to be probably looking a lot thicker and darker than mine. So it is a skill to get my crayon, my charcoal stick line to be fine enough and to have it sharpened to the right shape so that it's performing the way that I want it to. I should establish some page division. I'm going to use a ruler and just put these two forms right here on a flat ledge that it would be running more or less parallel to the viewer. And I'm going to use my ruler. I think that right in the middle of the paper would be good for this drawing. Those forms seem well placed, so I'm just measuring upward or downward, whichever, 9 inches, and putting some measuring marks here on the page, and then I'll use my yardstick or a little bit of a longer tool to draw an edge back here or a line. I don't want it to be as prominent where the objects are going to be in front of it. If I did get a big strong line right through the middle of there, it might be difficult to remove. And also I'm going to want to blur this line back there in the background. I'm kind of precursor here, just showing you that you don't want to draw that line too thick or too heavy either. We're going to need to blend it away because it's further away from us, so we're going to want to push that out of focus. Other tips and tricks I have with drawing, if you've been doing this in your other previous drawings, you might want to go back and make some modifications, but I don't like the charcoal or the pencil to go off the paper. So I want to thin it out or just erase it a little bit as it gets to the very edge of the sheet. Page division has been established. I think it's time to start to mass in some planes. I want to use our strategy of breaking things down into 3 basic colors, the paper white, and then we'll mass in some of our side planes to be about 25% gray, and then some of our cast shadows and core shadows to be 50%. We'll come back, we'll glaze it down, and then start to add some darker elements or darker notes at those cores and at those leading edges where we want stuff to pop out. We also going to need to mask in our space tone, and our typical range for our space tone is going to be between 25 and 50% gray. Let's go ahead and get started with the masking. I'm going to start here by swiping in some side plane values. Now the swipe here should be about the lightest kind of swipe color that you can use to fill in that plane. Vary the pitch of the charcoal stick to indicate a little bit of receding planes or perspective in the direction that you're swiping. So you don't always have to swipe in the same direction. And here it's a little bit tricky. I just want to blend or swipe a little bit of mask right through this front middle, right across that leading edge of that object, because that's a bleed tone. So it's actually okay if some of this 25% color sort of leaks out or blends out. It's actually kind of desirable or a good thing to let a little bit of the massing come out of some of the shapes, because I think it helps to create a little bit of softness, ability to blend some of the adjacent areas together. So every artist has to come up with their own level of what they think is quote-unquote neat enough, but I can tell you I am not particularly neat in a lot of things. I also have a lot of knowledge and skill about where to put the right color. So you can have a kind of approach, a gestural approach that becomes very personal and maybe is a little bit, I don't know if you think it's sloppy, but it's hand done, it's rustic, and that's okay. Some people are going to be even maybe a little more careful and have a better control in a sense, or care a little more than I do, and your coloring might look even a little nicer than mine, and that wouldn't be a problem. And you might also have issues. Sometimes what I'm doing here, I'm turning this charcoal the other direction and just sort of massing with the back edge. Sometimes you want to mask with the point because it's just it's a piece of sandpaper. This is what the sandpaper's for. It's for polishing these new charcoal sticks that you're trying to get the right shape on there so that you can lay that thing down on your paper and it can mask. It should move along. So here I want to mass in some planes here. It's just like coloring or something like that, using a kid's crayon. You probably all have some previous experience with that, and there's different approaches you may already have, or different strategies you may already have to using crayons, or to coloring stuff in or painting stuff in. And you can see I have kind of several different things that I do here. Here I'm kind of using a little bit of a combination between massing, which is purely putting the charcoal stick down on the side, and also using just a little bit of the point to kind of color it in with more of a hatch stroke. So I think hatching is good because it gives you a little more control, and ultimately gives the drawing a nice finished texture, and I think lets you layer and make decisions about color better. Sometimes though, if you can't get the swipe you need from the point, try turning your stick around and massing with the other side of the stick, or some of the squareness of the stick. That's what massing is about, is putting your stick down on the side, finding angles and shapes of your tools that are going to work for you so that you can paint in or fill in these planes that you are defining. So I'm going to mass in my planes, and again, there's not really always a rule. Sometimes I'm massing with the back or the side of my stick, other times I'm using the point of my stick. There's not always a right way. What's guiding me is the knowledge of where to put the different colors of mass. So I'm just at first establishing all of these side planes as basically being the same color, and the cast shadows as being that darker color, that 50% color. So that's my breakup here on those particular solids. Once I have those three planes or colors in place, I can start to make decisions about, well, are they right? Do they need to go a little lighter or a little bit darker? And then I might also have to come over here and say, hey, did those need to be a little lighter, a little darker, and by how much? After planes are masked in, I want to come back and start to use some dynamics here at the leading edge of the object. Now this is just, again, what I'm doing here. I have this thing kind of memorized, and I have an understanding about what I think it should look like. So I know that my shadow's on that side, so I'm just going to start to darken or add another coat of a little bit dark, more pressure here on the point. And here on my cores, what I'm doing now is I'm pulling my charcoal stick up to the point or to one of those square things on the back edge of the stick, and going darker, because in these cores, and you've got three cores that you can target. You've got these sit cores and the rim cores of the shadows. In those cores, those are places where you can work on your line art or work on adjusting the shapes of the forms, and you can press in a little darker. This area here is called the leading edge, and that is where you would find the core, the form core on something that was angular. So that would be the place, this leading edge. This is an index card, and I use this as kind of a ruler for charcoal, because it's kind of thin and flat. So it works good for materials that are kind of spreadable. Start at the leading edges, and you can mass in another coat on the plane. Start at the core shadows, the sit cores, the rim cores, and you can add more value in the cast shadow. But you don't want to take that cast shadow too dark. Shouldn't get too dark. One way you can tell if you're getting too dark is you're looking for cast shadows to be somewhere in the 50% range, this middle gray range. One thing that I've demonstrated before about what you can do here is I'm going to take my value scale and fold that so that I can lay it right up against the cast shadow and make comparisons about my value range. So this scale isn't just there for show. You can actually fold it in half so that you can use it to make decisions about colors and values in your finished piece, or as you're developing your work. Here I'm just going to kind of copy along. I see some darkness happening here at this plane change, and I'm going to mass in a little bit of extra dark, which would become a kind of like a core shadow. And then, this sit core is pretty accented here. It's very dark right there underneath of that form. So when I push in a little more on some of these areas where I want there to be more clarity, contrast here. There's reflected shadow here. So we're seeing a little bit of kind of a darkness down low on this part of the form. Maybe you expected it, maybe not, but this seems to be the darkest plane on the object, so I'm going to mask that in just a little bit darker. I know it looks like maybe I'm almost to black, but I'm really not. it's kind of an illusion, kind of a trick in a way. It's not black. I could press a lot harder than I am, but I think that because it's starting to look dark like that, probably means that I'm starting to get closer to where it should be. Maybe I need to swipe in a little bit of color right here, but I don't want to get it too dark. And it could also be I could get some of those tones in there with some glaze. But I'm going to lay just a little bit of color right there by pulling lightly through those planes. The things that you do in a charcoal drawing is if you're swiping, if you're massing, and it feels like your outlines or your edges are getting lost, you just kind of tip the charcoal stick up to the point and redraw those edges or those lines or those overlaps where you're missing stuff or where it seems like it's going away. So you get comfortable, you lay your stick down, you're massing with the side of it sometimes or even with the point, and then another time you pull that up to the tip it upwards, and you can just use it more like a pencil to put some line art back in. Got my planes masked in. Seems pretty decent. So I want to move on and start to put in some value in my background or my space tone. Backgrounds, space tones, things like that work better when the majority of your mark making and your swiping is horizontal. So here's another trick. I'm sure I've covered this on some of the other videos, but I want to repeat this idea here about what I do. It's called cutting in, and I'm going to take the square back edge of my charcoal stick, so not the point, but the square side works best. I'll put that square side right up against the outline of the object and pull. I'm creating a dynamic which I covered in some other videos, but what's happening here on this dynamic is that it's sharp on one side and soft on the other. So this side is sharp and this side is soft. And I'm achieving that by just kind of pressing down a little more on the side that's up against the line. And you can turn your stick a little bit, but I'm just going to cut in around my silhouette. And I'm also I am varying the pressure up against that outline to make it pop. When I'm turning my drawing, it's usually because I just can't reach something that I need to pull. And it's usually a little easier to pull charcoal rather than push it. Once objects are cut in, then I can take that color and start to blend it outward into my space tone. When I start to fill in or blend outward from the silhouette, I want to use broad horizontal strokes. And I think that those broad strokes that go across the drawing rather than up and down tend to look a little bit more like depth or space. So I'm going to avoid having too many lines that are going straight up and down in the background, but rather I think backgrounds work better when you mask them in with horizontal strokes. There's always exceptions to these kinds of rules, but that's what I'm sort of suggesting, I think, as a good fallback strategy when you're not sure what else to do. I could continue to work on some of these contrasts here. Really, everything looks pretty okay. That was the end of the massing in 6B charcoal. It's time to do a little glazing. I have a piece of soft paper towel here, just regular paper towel, and I'm going to glaze this drawing. So when you glaze, you want to use big broad swipes, and what you're trying to do here is get some of this mass tone in the space and in the object to share its value, share its color with some of these planes here, especially on the objects. And we're trying to take some of this active charcoal and just spread it around in kind of a gentle way. But what we're doing is trying to wipe a kind of film or color across the whole page, canceling out what was previously white. We can start to use this idea, and I'm not pressing very hard at first, but we can start to use this idea to push this layer in and sort of soften everything together at this early state. What this is doing is it's creating this deep layer in your drawing that you can continue then to work on top of. But the way that the visual effects of pushing this to the background and then coming back and developing more, developing the light and then developing the shadows, it starts to resonate kind of the way I think that we perceive light and shadow on objects. And even at this early state, you know, these things probably look pretty volumetric. The shading on them is working as a pretty good stand-in. But I think we can go further with this, and I want to also use this drawing as a way to talk about what to do with some of your other charcoals in your kit besides just the 6B. So after I glaze, what I want to do is start to erase. This is an index card and just a pink pearl eraser. And I'm going to use this index card as kind of a ruler, but it's also kind of a stencil or a masking tool. And I'm not pressing hard or at the same value all the time. And I'm not necessarily pressing hardest right at the outline of the card. So there's a lot of little tricks and subtleties that come with using a stencil like this. If your glaze is set up correctly here, what you've done is you've canceled out that white with a very fine gray film that you can cut into with your eraser. If you can't cut in to that film there, and you're not able to get these effects right away or easily, you probably didn't have enough charcoal here, or you glazed too much, or there's some other technical issue that went on with your setup. But if you've done some of these early phases correctly, erasing some of this glaze shouldn't be too difficult for you. You should get some quick and clear results without having to press a lot. Now, if you may have to start to press more, and that's the thing about erasing, is that you can adapt, and sometimes you may need to press a lot harder on things than you really were expecting to. So a little bit like the application with the charcoal, you know, sometimes the erasing pressure is really varied and dynamic as well. But what I'm doing now is sort of cleaning off this whole big broad shape on the table, or what we call the ground plane. So, and it's a little, I always say it's a little bit of a chore. You know, it's like students look at that and they're like, oh man, that's a lot of work to erase that whole big piece of paper. Yeah, you want to erase it, and what I say about stuff like this is you shouldn't try to protect the white, because then you don't get the ability to create transitions on in this area. So don't try to protect the white. That's the wrong thing to do with this approach. What you're trying to do is deliver or deposit or distribute a little bit of active glaze across the surface of the page so that you can build this look that is really hard to get any other way. It's hard to convince sometimes beginners to move forward, or that what they have is good enough, that it's working for where they're at. There's a lot of things like that in this method of drawing, where you're trying to work around the page a little, distribute your work a little more evenly or a little more holistically at first, so that you are developing a picture that has a pattern of light and shadow that is kind of filling in, or is taking account of the whole page instead of just some details on a single object. Saying, hey, hey, I can pull together this whole space into something that is kind of convincing. I don't mind a little bit of hatching and mark making. It's part of my aesthetic that you should have a little bit of texture in your finished piece. You shouldn't try to blend out everything completely either. So we want to have a little bit of energy, and you get that. You can get that kind of look by the way that you are handling your art materials and leaving little clues that something has a kind of hand-done texture or look. Little hatch marks or gestural swipes are kind of a thing that artists do to keep themselves interested, but I think it helps the viewer somehow participate in the process if they see a little bit of some mark making, or some brush strokes, or some hatch marks, or some eraser swipes. So you let us fill in some gaps, essentially, participate in your process if you maybe have a little bit of open-ended approach to what you're doing. Okay, I can see that I feel like some of these planes here are now still too dark, so I'm going to start to lighten those things up. I'm just going to take my eraser. This is kind of a thing, maybe you never thought of this, but sometimes the color that you might need is actually a sort of a stain or something that's left over after you erase most of the value off. And that you don't have to necessarily think, oh, just because I erased it that I have to do a lot more else to it. This value relationship here is starting to come into focus and be very close to what I want it to be. I have some chamois here, and one thing that I do with chamois is I use it on those planes after I've erased. And the chamois, what that chamois does is it's a little bit like an eraser itself. It has a kind of a light polishing effect. And if I put it down on those areas that I've been erasing, what it does is it's able to take out a lot of the kind of streaks and texture that has been occurring. So I can use my chamois to smooth out, or almost heal, in a sense, some of my eraser marks. I can also use it as kind of an eraser to lift color off of whole passages or whole planes, just like I might use an eraser itself. So again, what I'm suggesting here is that with eraser now and with chamois, as you're moving forward, what's oftentimes happening is that you're glazing even a little deeper with your chamois, and you're staining, you're creating stains that are saturating the page and getting a little smoother. And you can overdo this. And the rule of thumb basically is, you know, you're going to get to a certain point where you're not able to remove anymore. You shouldn't just keep necessarily grinding it, because you might burn your paper, change your paper significantly. So sometimes what you need to do to make something smoother is actually add a little more charcoal. Right now I'm still just using my chamois to kind of blend out some of these colors, some of these planes that are on the object, that are masked essentially to the right value, but are maybe a little too contrasty and a little too grainy or a little too textural. So the chamois is a great way to blend out some marks and other things in a drawing that's gone a little bit further now. What I don't want you to do is glaze with the chamois right away. If I started to glaze everything with the chamois, what happens is it's going to strip off or take off all of the charcoal that you've been depositing, and you'll lose too much information. So as a kind of a general rule, I say that, you know, the chamois is more for your light areas or for your medium colors, and that you don't want to use it so much in your darker values, because it will take off too much and you'll have to wind up putting a lot back on. Right now I'm just using the chamois to kind of tune up some of the contrast here between this object and background. This is a blending stump. I've trimmed this with a razor blade and some sandpaper to create a shape that I like. It's very similar to the shape that I like for the charcoal stick, but I'm going to use a blending stick in this area because it's kind of a small directed tool. You would typically use blending sticks in a couple of key locations, but basically what you're trying to do with the blending stick is make something push back. It's a little bit like in computer art where you can send something to a back layer. Or you could use a filter to blur it. So when we push something in, what we're doing, we're making it a little smoother, but what we're actually doing is sort of pushing it back in space a little bit. This is still chamois, and I'm working on that edge. Now I don't know if you saw that, but it's quite a bit of pressure here sometimes to get rid of some of that color. The chamois, the eraser in charcoal, sometimes what you're doing is trying to get back to just a stained color. And then this is a darker chamois, just has a lot more charcoal in it. You could essentially make one yourself, but mine came from experience. But you can see the darker the chamois, it glazes to a darker color. It's a little bit like having paint in a brush or something. So that's totally fine, you know, to play around with this idea of putting a little color in your rag or your chamois. At this point, that's one way you can smooth things out and get rid of some of these textures that maybe are happening from the massing and the buildup of the initial charcoal layer. So there's still a lot of flexibility with that charcoal. It's very plastic, it's very elastic. You can move it around. You can manipulate this stuff, and you just have to play around with it to understand some of its possibilities. Hopefully there's maybe some things in your previous experience that you can relate this to. We're going to use the chamois to glaze in this space tone too. I want to push that back. What it's doing is it's stripping off a lot of the color, but that works pretty good for the background because it also is getting rid of a lot of texture, and it's following that simple principle of drawing and 2D art that when I smudge something in, or when I soften or push something inward, it drops away from me. Could be the same color as what I had here, but as this gets pushed in and softened in, it's the same color basically, but it's going back away from me. You can use the chamois as kind of like a broad paintbrush, almost like watercolor or something, to put on soft, sweeping, broad tones that cut through planes and start to expand the value range of these objects, making the atmosphere a little more mellow. It's flexible, and you can work on this kind of stuff for a while. Come to a point where you say, hey, I need to stop because there's more charcoal in my kit. So all that was completed basically with 6B charcoal, erasers, and chamois. And that, it looks like it should be enough, but there's more we can do, and what we're going to do is come back and target our cores with a couple of different colors of black. And it's just kind of a strategy that's been around for a while with 2D art, is that you use it when you're doing a black and white image, you use more than one color of black to help increase the visual effects and the contrast. This is a little bit of Conti. All I'm doing is just going to mass in this black 2B black Conti into a couple of core shadows, sit cores, rim cores, and I sometimes use a line to sharpen something, or sometimes use a mass. And I just want to kind of do that as a kind of pattern or as a kind of system, and not judge it too much. Okay, just put a little bit of this new material in your cores, and just kind of start to do that consistently. But I don't have form cores on these objects. I have plane changes and leading edges. But those are the places where you would start to swipe in Conti or other new charcoals. We're using this new color to sharpen our drawing and also to add more contrast. You can see I'm too dark on that plane. Bring just a little more light in through here. I'll use this index card to help. And I need that because sometimes I want to press harder than I can comfortably inside of a plane or along an edge. It's a little bit like painting or something, where I am not really concentrating on lines anymore, but on shapes and on planes and on edges. Material's getting used in dynamic ways, it's getting blended in. There's always exceptions to our rules, but what I suggest here is that after you use your 6B is that you always then next move is to go to your 2B Conti. Use that 2B Conti to just do whatever revisions, massing and line quality that sort of stand out for you, seem like needs a little more work, and we're going to target those cores. Plane changes, cores, start there, mass in a little bit of value you need. You can use an index card or a ruler to help you get those shapes. What I'm doing with this card when I color with it or mask with it is I'm typically pulling off of the card, or use the edge as kind of a ruler, but I'm not going to push towards it because that will cause the card to move. Basically what you're doing is you're pulling your charcoal or your eraser off of the card into the work area. See, that's how you really can bring a lot of focus into these things, is work on these cores down here and keep your sharpness and your contrast at the base of those objects looking appropriate to your subject matter here. Kind of in that second phase, and rather than using my 6B, I'm using Conti to target those key areas and to make little corrections. And when you switch the material up to this little bit of a darker color, it has a nice kind of vibration, right? The contrast seems to happen quickly and easily, which is exactly what we want. What's happening is there's a color shift. Basically, the Conti is a little more cool or bluish black compared to the way that this charcoal looks when it gets glazed out. So the 6B is going to look a little more warm or brown, or maybe even neutral, and the Conti is going to shift a little bit more towards blue or black. So we can get a lot of snap without a lot of extra, because what's really happening here is I'm not just going darker. Actually, it's kind of like I've changed colors. Just like if you were, coloring with crayons, it's literally like changing your crayon color. And you can devise strategies for, putting these different shades of gray, different shades of black in key spots. So one of our main strategies here is we're going to deposit the Conti, and then some of the other color, the heritage color, we'll put that into our cores and our space tone. What I want to maybe avoid doing with some of these later colors is using them too much around outlines of objects, or to do a lot of line quality. Now there's always some times where you could, some exceptions where you could put an outline or a leading edge in with Conti or with heritage, but again, I'm going to use these things and try to use them in a methodical way, so that I'm putting them into core shadows and space tone. This is my dirty chamois. Still just, I can come back and smooth out some of the Conti now. Other tools that people use sometimes for softening charcoal are sponges or brushes. Not things that I typically use a lot, but they are interesting, and with a little bit of experimentation, trial and error, can definitely help to create some interesting and potentially useful softening effects. They're not that much different than taking your blending stick and putting it down into that fresh Conti that you've just deposited and starting to push that in a little bit. A little bit of another exception here. It's slightly different than what I do with the 6B or with the initial stuff, is that after I have some of that Conti distributed, I'll start to glaze. This is a cotton rag, different than the paper towel, but similar. One of the differences between the Conti crayon and the other charcoal is that I'm going to start to glaze and blend and smudge the Conti much sooner, and I think that's okay. It does kind of open up a lot of ability to blend and to go back and forth, and can be kind of challenging and frustrating, but I think it's ultimately good, which is what I'm suggesting here, is you don't have to wait to blend the Conti in quite the same way that you were maybe waiting for the 6B. This is that piece of it's called art sponge, but you might have something like that. You can get it at any art store, or you could also use maybe like a makeup sponge. Also would be a good similar tool. Sometimes the best thing you can do is take off most of the color get back to this stain color that you set up a long time ago and use your chamois or one of those other smoothing tools. Kind of get back to just the stain. Sometimes the color of the paper that after you erase, and chamois as much as you can is what you need. It's better to have set it up that way, to put that material down and distribute it and giving yourself the ability to erase it and to modify it. It's better to go through all these things where I have to erase it and put it back down than to never have put that material there in the first place. If I won't get that sense of unity and broad completion if I am too careful, I'm only glazing in one spot, or I don't do some of those initial setup layers. After some of those initial layers are done, you can spend literally as much time as you want to massing and glazing and erasing and redrawing through these planes to get the look and the value and the softness that you're after. You can't be too afraid of it. Sometimes the best thing you do is just to take your tissue or your towel and push it in a little bit. Once I put a little bit of Conti in my main subject, I need to distribute some of that through the background. It doesn't have to be a lot. Things look a little odd often if we get Conti in some places but not others. So it's just a rule. Helps to increase unity and movement in your piece. That once you have Conti or other new charcoal distributed through your main subject, you have to bring it through your background. And that's part of our game. What that's doing is it's increasing movement in our piece. Brains and eyes now making links between object and background in even a little more complicated way than they were just a few seconds ago before the Conti got swiped onto the background. So I don't need a lot of Conti back there to get the effect to be what it's supposed to be doing. Swipe a little bit more Conti. What you typically do with backgrounds, you can make them a little darker along the edges and a little darker along where the page division is happening. So what I want to do after I've got that Conti out there in the background is I need to glaze it in and then erase a little bit off. Again, in this case, what you're doing slightly differently is I'm not going to glaze right through these objects with the same kind of pressure or energy that I did early on. I don't want to have to keep wiping off the white at this point. And the paper isn't going to take a lot more erasing. So again, the exception here, the slight difference is I'm not going to glaze all the way through everything this time around. Be a little more localized, a little more targeted, work the glaze into smaller shapes and right up against edges now. This is just a cotton towel, cotton t-shirt rag, but you could also use a paper towel or some other softer glazing tool. If you can't reach something, just turn it. If I had the ability to move around, I might stand up once in a while and get back from my art, or even work on it standing up at a table for a few minutes here or there. The space tone is a chore. It takes a little bit of effort to get that value back there to look like you want it to be smooth enough and dark enough, to have the right transitions in it. This is a chamois. It seems like, oh, you put it on and then why go to all that? Well, I just think it improves the look. It's just deepening, subtly deepening the richness and the movement in the piece. It also is intended to help students make, connections about creating a process for themselves. when they're being creative, to have some sets of rules or sets of steps is part of the mark of being a creative type, wanting to follow recipes or formulas. This is what's going to ultimately let you start to invent and create things for yourself. So a little bit of glaze comes over that edge as you're drawing. It's okay. I'm just going to take my index card and my eraser and clean up some of these edges here that got a little lost when I was glazing. What you can do, use your cleaner chamois to clean off the lit planes, the white areas. It helps to smooth out those transitions in the lights. A lot of times it happens as your drawing gets a little more developed, these shadows start to get maybe a little too dark, so I come back and take my value scale and hold it up to those shadows and check to make sure that some of those internal colors aren't getting too dark. And if they are, what you do is you take your chamois and you soak up some of the color on the inside of the cast shadow. It's kind of a mystery, or it seems strange to beginners sometimes, but a lot of times beginners get shadows too dark, and shadows work better if they are kept in the more of the moderate range or the inside color. Sometimes I'm even going to take my eraser and almost get rid of most of the color, or get rid of the color inside there with your chamois. It doesn't take a lot of contrast sometimes, less maybe than you think. So keep your shadows a little bit lighter, a little bit translucent sometimes is what we say. A couple final steps here are to repeat those ideas of targeting the cores, but to do it with another level of dark color or black. This time I'm going to use my Heritage. Same idea. Heritage is very dark and it's very blendable, and it doesn't take a lot. Target those cores, stroke in a little bit of charcoal where you think you need just a little bit of extra dark in your cores. And this material, my exception for this material is that I use a lot of fingertips. You can blend this with fingertips or other tools pretty easily. And then the other rule with this one is that you don't want to overdo it. You don't need to use too much. You shouldn't try to blend this one too much either. Add the Heritage into the core shadows. There's a lot of creativity here involved. You don't need to add a lot. And it's an opinion. Some drawings you might want to have a more dramatic and full value range and may need to use quite a bit of this dark at the end, and other drawings you may just not want to use very much of it at all. Students, it just takes a while to process all of these different colors that are going to get layered together and what they do. Part of this assignment is to give you more opportunities to explore our three main charcoals and to go through some of those basic strategies. Once you introduce a new charcoal, you have to distribute it through the three cores of your main subject and then into the space tone. When you do that, when you're distributing that charcoal through your main subject and through your background, you're creating movement. So it's a subtle game that we're doing on purpose. Okay, it's just to help us as creatives or as artists to lead our viewers, put them where we want them in our drawing. And we're doing that with color and value and with the visual elements. It's color because what's actually happening is that the new charcoals are actually adding a slight color shift as well as a value shift in your work. Once I have some in my main subject, it needs to get distributed to my space. I keep it pretty loose at this point. I don't want there to be a lot of heavy buildup of my Heritage. You use that to shade what would be shadow in the background. Now you can decide how much texture, as a general rule of thumb. Once you start to introduce a new charcoal, new color into your work, you need to distribute it through your main subject and also through your background. What you're trying to do is depict a little bit of shadow or shading now on the background somehow. take my cotton rag and glaze this in just a little bit. It's up to you. You can have a background that is as dark really as you like it, or you can strip off some of these colors to push that gray even further back now. Get rid of some of that surface texture piece of cotton rag, but I may also continue on with my chamois, soaking up even just a little more color. Sure, it's a little extra work, but going through those sets of steps gives you a kind of cohesive process that you can kind of fall back on. It's kind of a benchmark for making decisions about should I use this art material or not. I think we teach it this way too. It's also having a process, having a formula lets you maybe expand that thinking into other aspects of your life, but it gives you a system that you can improvise upon as well. One of the final steps here with charcoal drawing is just to put in some highlights. Sometimes with highlights I like to use a charcoal pencil to define a shape. In this case, I'll just define kind of a long skinny shape here that runs along that plane change. Use an index card and an eraser, and I'll erase the zone where I'm going to lay down the white conti. So it's kind of a rule, you don't want to put your white conti into places that have charcoal in them. That's going to make a mess. You could also try just erasing a line essentially along the leading edges or along the plane changes. That's typically where you're going to see highlights on angular forms, is at the plane changes. You want to make sure that where you're going to lay down your white is nice and clean. So clean it off so that it doesn't smudge in or mix in with the other charcoal that is already there on the surface. You want that white to be not blended. The white shouldn't get mixed in with the gray charcoal underneath. That's when you get kind of weird blue-gray look. So keep the white more localized in the front middle of your objects, at plane changes, and along the tops of things. Don't put the white along the back outline of objects. That will create flatness in your piece, but if you keep the white nice and clean and fresh and kind of localized in the top plane highlights basically, or maybe in something that's really white or light, maybe sometimes you need to even mass in a whole plane. Like right here I could probably mass in or hatch in a little bit of white right there across that whole plane just because it's so bright. So along plane changes, top plane, shiny highlights. Don't try to use the white as like a correction fluid. It's just there to create contrast, and it's also a little bit of a color thing, a color shift that's happening with the white. It doesn't blend well with the charcoal, but what it does do is it complements it nicely if it's sitting next to or adjacent to. Another place that's not super intuitive that you can put some white charcoal is along the rim core, where there's a lot of bright light on a ground plane at the front of an object. You can have sharpness. We can use the white to create a little extra sharpness in the cast shadow. What you don't really want to do with the white is put it on your outlines that go up and over your form. Keep it more localized in the front middle and at the plane changes on the inside of your object. Alright everyone, thank you.